We are admitting them as they come in, and right now there is nobody in the room.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Curtis Monger. I am the National Leader of Soil Survey Standards and the liaison to the North Central National Cooperative Soil Survey. I'm your moderator this afternoon. Sam Indurante, who moderated this morning, will be back in the morning. I will also be back tomorrow afternoon as the moderator. On Thursday, we'll have John Cabrick and Mark Abney as the moderators for the field trip. Again, if you have questions for the speakers, please email that address, which is muconf9f9@missouri.edu, which you have in your inbox. And I will relay those to the speaker if we have time. I'd also want to point out that if you look at the website for this conference, you will find the posters and the abstracts. So with that, I would like to move on to our first speaker, which is Skye Wills, the National Leader for Soil Science Research, to discuss soil survey research needs in a changing world. Skye?
All right, thanks, Curtis. Do you all see my full screen there?
Yes, Skye, your screen looks great.
Great, thank you. Okay, so when I first heard the topic that Sam asked me to speak to, it's soil survey research in a changing world. And I took that originally thinking more in terms of like climate change and temperature change, you know, more directly related to soil survey. But as I thought about it, I really thought, you know, I should expand that concept because there's a lot of things that are changing about the world right now. So the world is changing not only in those climate and the inputs to things we think about in terms of soil properties, but it's changing in the ways we interact with soil data. So Land PKS or Quit Carbon have different ways to take soil survey information and morph it into something for particular users. And then every single one of us and most producers we interact with have a handheld device that they can pull up soil data in their hands in a way that we've, you know, never really had before and that our current products are not really tailored for. And so when we're thinking about the changing world, we really want to include all of those. Like we're thinking about what soil research and soil survey research in particular is going to be like going forward. It really has to include all of these aspects. So a traditional thought of soil survey is static. And I just heard a report from Dylan, who you'll hear from in a little bit, about talking to some of our cooperatives, and they really felt like soil survey was like a done deal, a static thing. And we have this, you know, really classic functional conceptual relationship we use to say what soil properties happen where. But we know that that's not the end of the story. You can bring in, you know, the ScorePan or digital soil mapping products. You can bring in dynamic stuff and talk about how things change. And so there's a whole range of ways that we have to make soil research change for the future. We know it's not a static map. It isn't really shown to people as a static map, but yet our users interpret it that way. So we have to think about how do we move beyond static and into the dynamic. So as we can change outputs, we can have variable, or excuse me, as we can change inputs, then we get variable outputs. So the first way, at least when I think about this from a research standpoint, is how do I change things like interpretations and uses by changing input information? That means we can use some pretty traditional models without changing a ton about what goes into them. And then that should help us address some changing needs, our changing customers. So instead of having to really separate out all these different ways the worlds are changing, we can incorporate the changes in inputs to influence the way the changes in outputs are made. And hopefully we can think in terms of a brand new soil survey and a brand new soil research program where we're incorporating all these things into one big picture. And so, for instance, the soil health GSPs, we're thinking about reference values, we're thinking about inputs as like, what's the management system there? What were the inputs? What was the rainfall? We want to use our existing soil survey inputs, but we know that's not going to be enough. We're going to need more in order to reach these people. So I'm actually going to insert a talk within a talk and tell you what I told the Soil and Water Conservation Society, I guess 2 weeks ago. And because it's an example of soil research that I think is going in a different direction. And while we're trying to link it to our soil survey databases and link it to pedological concepts, ecological site concepts, it's really thinking about things that we haven't traditionally addressed with soil survey. And so this was called Using Dynamic Soil Properties to Set Soil Health Indicator Reference Conditions for Soil Survey. And as it's been mentioned, dynamic soil properties are properties that change on the human timescale with land use and management. And soil health has this long official definition, but basically it's how soils function for us. And often we just, think about how the soil is going to do the things that we need it to do sustainably. And as part of that effort, the Soil Health Division has introduced a soil health tech note with recommended soil health indicators and lab procedures. And so we have a research project where we have cooperating universities all over the country to assess common set of laboratory and field indicators across a range of soils and a range of management systems. And the overall goals of this are to really develop reference values so that if someone measures a property, they have an idea of what it means. If you say the soil has a pH of 7, I have a pretty reasonable idea what that means. But for some of these newer metrics and indicators, I don't necessarily know what they mean. So that's really the first thing we're trying to get at. We also want to see, do they work the same for different soils? They probably won't. We know that from soil survey research, but oftentimes newer research that's done without pedological influence isn't really considered different kinds of soils, different parent materials, things like that. And then finally, we want to link these to some of our soil survey and KSSL databases and see if we can make sense of them in terms of soil survey. So it's a long list of properties that we're evaluating. Some of these are lab methods, some are field, but today I'm going to talk about phospholipid fatty acid, which was measured at the Soil Health Assessment Center, where you are in Columbia, and then 4 properties that were measured at the Kellogg Soil Survey Lab, and that's organic carbon, aggregate stability, beta-glucosidase, and permanganate oxidizable carbon. So to throw this in the mix, since we're talking about reference conditions, we really want to put that in the context of how the rest of soil survey thinks of reference conditions. So ecological sites and the state and transition models that are associated with it. So we think ecological sites are kind of land. And then they can be described through the state and transition model. Sorry about that. And then the reference condition can be said to have, a certain number of frills, a certain amount of vegetation. We know what we think. And if you have used interpreting indicators of rangeland health, you'll see all these things that you can benchmark what you're seeing to. Well, we think we should be able to do some similar things with dynamic soil properties. So in this case, imagine that you have a sample and you take aggregate stability and it's 25%. Well, what does that mean to you? Is that good? Is that bad? Well, it depends on where it is. That's usually the first answer when it comes to soil, right? It depends. So if you're in a clayey, relatively moist situation, 25% may not be as much as you could expect in a reference condition. However, in something sandier, perhaps from a drier area, 25% might be pretty good. And in this case, that's exactly what we see. So what 25% that is, depends on where you come from. Another way we can think about this is to put soil functions or ecosystem services. So you can think about carbon, aggregate stability, anything where more is better on this. You can think in terms of ecological potential. That's the stuff that'd be covered by our traditional native or naturalized plant community. And you can think in terms of, well, what might I want to do with that in terms of management? And in this case, the grain rotation might be the thing we're really interested in. And maybe even within that, there'd be different kinds of management systems that would have a different response or a different soil function or soil health indicator. And so that's really thinking in terms of very conceptual, right? We're just sort of thinking, oh, well, these things are expected to be better than others. So now this is where we take that research project and we put in some real data. So if I have phospholipid fatty acid, and this is just total PLFA measured, it's not a particularly precise measure, but it just illustrates a concept. And I've actually pooled all the soils here together, so there's probably a lot more information to be teased out. But we could think in terms of, okay, here's the ecological potential in the perennial systems, and here's what is attainable for grain rotations. And we've done that through two ways, till and no-till, but there were some differences, but not huge. We could also separate those into individual groups for each individual soil. And as you can see here, it's a complicated graph, but the main thing I want you to get, whoops, sorry about that. The main thing I want you to get from the graph is that both the soil and the management system matters. And so whenever we're thinking about PLFA or really any biological indicator, it's going to be complicated getting to what it means and what our reference and benchmark is. So the next thing we did is send these samples. These are the surface samples that were sent to KSSL, and we measured 5 things that we already measured. So these aren't new methods. And while these are on the list of soil health indicators, they're things that we have done for a while and have a decent idea how to get reliable results on. Water stable aggregates, beta-glucosidase is a soil enzyme. Permanganate oxidizable carbon is sometimes called active carbon, but it's a chemically reactive form of carbon. And then total soil organic carbon. And it's a little complicated to look at all of these different soils and these different treatment systems. So I'm going to focus on water stable aggregates here. And you can see that while, there's some similarities between soils, the total reference condition, which this I'm marking as the perennial system is higher for almost every soil. And so we can set a reference condition for any management system to try to reach. And maybe it's reasonable and maybe it's not. We haven't quite got that far. But the idea is these soil health indicators have a reference condition. They have something that we can tie to as a benchmark for future use. So how are we going to link this information to soil survey? Well, we're going to do it by soil, right? So we'll separate these out. We'll look at maybe more specific than just a reference condition. We'll label that and talk about what it means. So maybe it's a forest for the Cecil soil, grassland for Colby, and the Palouse as well. And so we can start to think about not only what's the research implications of this, which is, look, I can show that the reference conditions are different for some properties and not others, but we can also think about how we tie this back to soil survey, right? So our preliminary results, and these are really preliminary, I'll stress that, is ecological sites and straight transition models show some promise for grouping soils and organizing information. So instead of having like a big old range of properties in terms of moisture, texture, temperature, that's one way to look at it. Another is to use our conceptual thought about how ecological sites respond differently. We can put this reference condition, and the next step will be to decide, okay, I have these samples from a Colby soil. What else do they represent? Just that ecological site? Are there other ecological sites? There's a whole host of questions that you can ask out of this data, and we intend to, but it gives us an idea for the world is changing, the things we want to know about our data are changing, and this is a framework we can use to ask this question. So we have a whole long list of cooperating institutions for that. And I just wanted to point it out to this group because it's something you might not have seen. You might not know everything that's going on. The research isn't done. There are more universities that haven't sent their samples in yet. We haven't finished parsing it. There's some oddities in the data you may have seen that haven't been totally cleaned up. We may need to do reruns or something, but it's just an idea of how to organize and convey that information to other people. And part of the reason we need to do that are these changing customers and these changing uses. So if a modeler wants our data, what do they want? They might want a soil property that's continuous with absolutely no holes or discontinuous breaks. Maybe for regenerative ag, they love the idea of reference conditions because then they can see how close they think they are to a potential. Citizen scientists may just want to make decent measurements for later use. So all of these groups have specific needs and ways they want to get at our data. We probably won't be able to get at all of them, but we can try to think about how we can meet big groups. And so that's something that's, it's a big soil survey question, but it's specifically a research question. And maybe we need to think more about researching how people use our data as much as how to produce the best data. So a couple of examples of that, this is courtesy of Jason Nemechek. We can put in, NRCS uses our data to take a soil survey map unit and then change it into a risk. And this is a little bit different than a classic interpretation because they're thinking of a risk of something bad happening given a certain conservation program. So I kind of think about what are we good at and what should soil survey focus on, you know, in terms of research. And the thing I keep coming back to is we're really good at landscapes. We have these conceptual models of landscapes. We know how they interact with smaller scales and larger scales. And we don't really have the personnel or the expertise to get into the tiny biogeochemical processes. And we don't really have people working necessarily on like earth system models or policy outcomes, but the landscape part of soil, we're really good at. And so how to use that landscape model, how to think about how to scale up or scale down, how to transfer, those are things that I think are going to be really productive. And I also think this is going to tie directly into what you'll hear about later, which is dynamic soil survey and really capturing how things change, especially soil moisture on a landscape scale. And then we have some work, Zamir Liwahova has some work currently with the state of Nebraska looking at landscape scale, soil water movement in conjunction with conservation programs, in conjunction with soil health programs, and bringing all those things together, I think is really where soil research needs to go into the future. And so while current soil survey is useful for managing and interpreting change, I mean, I think you can learn a lot, right? We've all shown somebody a soil survey and they've been amazed by the amount of information they can get out of it. But we have to think about how people are using our data and how we can present things in a way that's relevant to our users. And that's not necessarily the thing we've always conducted research to in the past, but I think we should really think about that going forward. The other thing, which I guess I'll say it on this slide somewhere else, is we're going to have to really be cooperators. We don't have infinite resources. We don't have all of the programs we used to have in the past, and we're going to have to learn to cooperate with each other, you guys at the National Cooperative Soil Survey meeting, and with other disciplines that do things in different ways than we've done them in the past. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions anyone might have.
Well, Sky, no questions have come in yet. I'll still be on the lookout for any, but.
I just did have one come in.
Okay.
I will go ahead and read that directly.
Mm-hmm.
For DSP by land use interactions, how do you account for time under a specific management? For example, 2 years no-till may not be the same as 10 years no-till.
That's a really great question. The way we've dealt with it at this point is to try to find systems that we think are at a, I'm going to say quasi-steady state, that have reached some sort of an equilibrium. So we tend to focus on the established management systems of at least 5, and really 10 years is better, because yes, there's definitely a trajectory between 2 and 25 years or whatever. And we have to rely on our cooperators in agronomic and really experimental work to figure out where to draw those lines and how to organize the real world into things that we can compare.
I do not have any more questions that have come through on the MUConf9 email at this time.
Okay, I have one for Sky. We still have about 5 minutes. You've been working with dynamic soil properties for some time now. In your opinion, or based on your knowledge, what is the most significant dynamic soil property and why?
So So the word significant gives me pause, but I'll say it this way so that I can't get in trouble for it because it's my favorite. And it's like the color blue is my favorite color. My favorite dynamic soil property is aggregate stability. And that's because it integrates biological and physical processes. It integrates temporally somewhat, so it tends to not vary seasonally or day to day. I mean, there is a little bit, but not nearly as much as some of the biological indicators. And you can see it. It's impressive to see, and then to be able to measure that at the same time. And knowing that it's related to biology and water movement and all of the things that we care about, I just think it's a really good overall property to keep an eye on. Jason says carbon. Carbon is the most important. Carbon is a pretty big deal. I mean, for a lot of reasons. But I really like aggregate stability. Carbon changes pretty slowly. But honestly, the thickness of topsoil, which we don't often call a dynamic soil property, but the horizonation is tremendously important and something that really only pedologists pay attention to. But if you think about sustainability and the ability of something to function, you have to know how those layers are arranged. And so we've tried to do that with this project. It's been really eye-opening for the agronomists that we've cooperated with. But knowing, you can't know how much carbon is there unless you know the horizon thickness, right? So I mean, that's sort of the pedologist's secondary approach, I guess. Aggregate stability and horizon thickness.
Curtis, there is a comment in the chat.
Yes. Sky, I just lost it. Hold on one second.
Who should we be cooperating more with, or who do we need to cooperate with that we haven't yet? Well, I've tried really hard to cooperate with groups that go to the American Geophysical Union. So those are the biogeochemists and hydrologists, and some of them are like computational biologists, those or system modelers for that matter, because they have a very different outlook than we do. They don't focus just on agricultural, although they're really interested in it. So I think we need to do a better job like cooperating with those folks. And then we probably need to do a better job with the agronomists that sometimes, you know, the pedologists that are left might be in the same department, but they're not really cooperating on research in a way that benefits us anyway. So I think those are two groups we should really work with.
Curtis, I did just email you another question. Did you receive that, or would you like me to give that?
Please give it, Jen.
Okay. You mentioned the landscape scale as the scale that we are experts at. I agree. With that in mind, what role do you foresee for computer simulation models from other disciplines, such as groundwater models, in bringing small scale measurements to landscape scale knowledge that we like to communicate?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I'm gonna like punt that one to Dylan and Zamir when they talk later. I mean, I think it's really important that those modelers, as they get more able to deal with computational just load and uncertainty, that we have to work with them on making their models take spatially explicit information, because right now it's often very probabilistic, or, you know, if it's a large enough area, they just need one value for bulk density, as Zamir said the other day. And if we can work with them and see how our spatially explicit information can help them have better models, that would be a real step forward.
Very good. Thank you, Sky.
Thank you.
Well, that's a good segue into our next presentation, actually, by Tom Bono, who is an assistant research professor at USDA Missouri Northeast Climate Science Center. And Tom, would you please proceed with your presentation on the modeling effects of climate change?
Thank you, Curtis. Can you guys hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Can you see my screen? Okay. Well, thank you guys for having me. This is a neat chance to kind of reach out and talk a little bit about some of the work that I do. Having received my bachelor's here from MU, I can actually remember my junior year, I think, of my bachelor's, taking soils from Randy Miles and Stephen Anderson. And while I certainly found it interesting, it's not to say that I did not expect to, as a fish and wildlife major, to be giving a talk at a soils conference. So this is a neat surprise. So thank you. So today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about some of the work that we're doing here at MU regarding modeling the effects of climate change on vegetation and habitat. And a crucial component of that you'll see here is using soil information. And so a major portion, as a wildlife ecologist, a major focus of my research right now, and as I'm affiliated with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, I'm focused a lot on trying to identify ways that we can adapt and manage resources under climate change. And under that approach, there's a couple different steps to that. And the first one is we need to understand the impacts in ecosystems and biodiversity. So what kind of threats or impacts do climate change pose? We're often in the exploration phase of that. Some obvious impacts we know about, but there are a lot of ones that we're still uncovering. And then the problem only becomes more difficult is once we have identified those impacts, we're also charged with trying to identify ways that we can actually adapt or mitigate those impacts through management of resources, whether it be forests or population management or something. And so that entails a lot of the work that we do, and that's the same approach taken oftentimes when you look at some of the larger national or international reports that are put out, such as the National Climate Assessment from the U.S. Global Research Program or different reports from the IPC. They all look at what are these effects, and impacts on ecosystems, and what are the potential ways we can adapt to that. So it's a major focus of work. And certainly there are no shortage of impacts and threats when it comes to habitat or forests and wildlife species. Just a quick, search will pull up a few articles, the idea that climate change is really starting to affect habitat globally. And even though land use change and management is a big deal now, climate change is going to become the preeminent threat very soon. We've also started to see examples where there was these interactions of soil temperatures and tick populations and warming winters. And with these booming tick populations, we're starting to see risk to something as big as a moose. Moose populations are declining now because of the exploding tick populations. So that's an interesting kind of interaction or threat right there. And we've even, here at MU, have even done some work looking at the effect of climate change on songbirds and how some of these populations of songbirds throughout the Midwest or northern regions are going to be threatened from climate change through the interactions of predators and habitat. So there certainly is no shortage of impacts, and that's what we continue to look for. And as we kind of go down the road of developing approaches to identify and understand what those potential impacts could be for these ecosystems, we need to remember that the root of the problem here is climate change, and climate change is inherently physical. And so that kind of leads us down a path, a logical path of what we need to incorporate in our approaches. If climate change is inherently physical, and ecology often involves complex biophysical processes, many of those processes happen to depend upon the properties of the soil or take place in the soil, right? So that just leads us to that understanding that it's critical to incorporate the information we have on soils when we start to look at any potential impact. And so that's why at MU over the last 8 years, I've been working with a team of folks, some really smart people from the U.S. Forest Service, from MU, and from the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, to really put together what we've called an integrated landscape modeling approach. And the idea here is that we want to combine those kinds of important components of ecosystems and landscapes and how we model them into one large approach that can really tell us what climate or conservation or urbanization, what are all these threats are going to be, and understand what the impacts will be on landscapes and ultimately habitat, and then for my sake, wildlife population. And so there have been a lot of folks that I've listed down here below that have contributed to this. And we've done a number of different studies and produced some various products as we put together this larger program. What I want to do today is I want to show you just a few examples of some of these products where soils has come into play in a direct way, and where we can actually see some of the results based on the effects of or the interaction of climate with soils. And so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the systematic thresholds and analysis, where we looked at systematic thresholds and tree growth under climate change. And then we'll kind of move on to looking at kind of a more realistic, broader impact of climate change on forest ecosystem transition, and then ultimately changes in tree distribution, tree species distributions across landscapes and regions. And then finally, I'll wrap up with some effects that we did that we looked at the effect of climate on a songbird population. And so before I start to describe some of the examples, I think it's important to focus in on really how are we integrating soils in this larger modeling approach. And so to do that, when we started out with this process early back in 2008 or 2010 or so, we identified a forest ecosystem process model called linkages that was developed by Wolschlager in the early 2000s. So in this ecosystem process model, there's a lot of biogeochemical processes that are captured to ultimately model the growth and survival of trees in a stand or a plot in a simulated fashion. And so we have to parameterize a lot of things here, but you can see that a lot of the processes that are captured. This is an original schematic of this model from the original publications. And so my collaborators took that model and revised it and developed it in a way that they could apply it to projections or future projections of climate over time. So we could start to see the dynamic response of forest growth over time, given soil properties and climate change. And so just a little more info exactly about how we're using this model. Here's a kind of a revised schematic of the different processes that are captured in the linkages model. As you can see, we're capturing atmospheric processes as well as aspects of the water cycle, such as transpiration, infiltration, and available water, and so on. We are also including organic processes or soil, biophysical processes, including organic matter, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and so on, to ultimately model growth and productivity of the vegetation. And so this is all being captured. And what this model does is it models individual trees in a stand, and it's a non-spatial way at this point. But we look at growth and survival, competition, seedling establishment, and so on. And the properties that we are using, soil properties that we're using in this linkages model, we derive from the Surgo data. And we're looking at layer thickness, stone fraction, water content, hydraulic conductivity, and matrix. And this model here actually models at a daily time scale. So it works well with trying to capture the changes, seasonal changes, and the changes over time as we look at the effects on tree growth. So with that linkages model set up like it is, you can see how then if we know the information about soils, we can parameterize this model. We can include species, tree species data on life history and growth and dispersal and so on, and those kind of things. So we can parameterize this model with all that info. Then all that's left is to incorporate projected temperature, precip, solar radiation, and wind from climate projections. And so that's how we use this model. That we can apply to different sites for different tree species, and we just look at climate change. And so that's the first example I want to kind of get to then, is this idea of we first started out with looking at systematic thresholds in tree growth. And so we took this kind of systematic approach where we looked at a few subsections across the eastern US, and we looked at a range of tree species that varied in their drought tolerance and shade tolerance. And we looked at a whole systematic setup of climate change scenarios. Now, these are not downscale climate projections per se, but the systematic scenarios we picked and implemented were based on those. So they kind of reflect the potential future climate change. But we did this in a way so we can actually start to identify at what level of temperature increase do we start to see threshold effects and so on. So you can see we targeted things such as maximum temperature, minimum temperature, total monthly precipitation, consecutive dry days, solar radiation, etc. And so we incorporated all these into linkages, and we modeled tree stands for those different species over time, over 200 years in this simulation. And we looked at the results in terms of biomass, stem densities, and size distributions. And what I'm showing you here are outputs that look at the relative change in stem densities and biomass for all these different species in these different subsections or the states they occur in under the maximum temperature scenarios. So this is just one of the sets of the scenarios we looked at. And this is temperature increases of 2 degrees up to 8 degrees Celsius. These are average daily max temperatures throughout the year. And what you can see is that we really do start to see some pretty dramatic effects on these stands as they grow over time under these different increased temperature scenarios. And in fact, maximum temperature and minimum temperature for all these species, as well as total monthly precipitation, tended to be the scenarios that drove the largest impacts to these species in this analysis. And all of this was geared to water availability. And I want to point out that what you see here is these are organized vertically along the northern to southernmost latitudes of these subsections. And so you can, for these different species, you can see that the strongest effects were often on the southern ranges of these tree species. And that makes sense, right? That's where they're probably, the southern ranges where they're most limited by water availability or temperature, for example. And so we can see that some of these increases in temperature are really contributing to almost 100% on some of these scenarios, 100% loss in biomass and stems. Okay, so that's where we saw a lot of really strong effects. In fact, many thresholds were mediated by water competition among stand size classes and properties of the soil. And so what we're getting at here is that water availability really was the main issue that we identified with this particular systematic analysis. Here's an example of sugar maple, a graph of biomass of sugar maple stands in the Current River Hills of Missouri. And you can see the scenarios we have here are total monthly precipitation. We have a baseline, and we've increased that precipitation by 40% over months, or we've decreased it by 40%. And you can see the presence of those thresholds in some of these cases, where it's growing along, biomass is increasing, and all of a sudden we hit a year where there is too little moisture, we see a die-off in biomass. And then it climbs back up and we might see another one. And so a lot of this was really driven by competition for water in the soil. And it was also mediated not just by the soil properties, but by the size distribution of the trees in the stands. So when there were a lot of larger trees, we saw decreases in mortality in the smaller size classes because they were not able to compete for the water at those depths. So that's just an example of some of the work from that particular analysis. I'm going to shift to the second analysis where Jacob Fraser has kind of expanded on this to make these results a little more realistic. And so we've expanded spatially to look at the entire eastern US. And we also started incorporating specific daily climate projections from the actual IPCC models or CMET models. And so he looks at a variety of models that includes the climate data from those downscaled models for those different subsections. He also included 5 different soils from each of the subsections in the properties of those soils. And then he kind of created these forest plots now to reflect the forest that's actually out there in those regions based on forest inventory and analysis data. And he used linkages and incorporated all that into linkages again and simulated 200 years worth of growth under a current climate as well as those 5 GCM models. And what he was looking at was the impacts on forest ecosystem transitions. So he was looking at density and biomass of forest plots or forest stands over time under these different climate models. And what he found was that by and large, we did see decreases in these subsections in biomass and the number of stems in forests. Now, these are all simulated projections. You can see for stem density, for some of the more severe climate scenarios like the access model, we see dramatic decreases in stem densities. And in some of these subsections, dramatic, more than 60% decreases in biomass. So what are the implications of those kind of decreases? Well, that's what he concluded. He found that soil properties, in particular depth and water content, contributed most to the response of forests to climate change in terms of the loss of biomass and stem density. And in fact, some of those effects were strong enough and substantial enough to suggest that some of these areas would see transitions among community types. So in other words, some of the areas in this map here, the subsections that have the orange or red filled colors, are really subsections where there's a potential to go from a forest to a woodland, or from a woodland to a savanna, just because of the loss in productivity. In some cases, we might actually see forests die off to the point of going straight to forest to savanna or grass. So that's what some of his projections showed over time. Now, for the third example, we're going to kind of transition just from linkages now and show how we've incorporated some of these outputs on the growth of trees over time from linkages into the Landis model, which is a forest succession or landscape model that can model things like tree growth and competition and all those properties we're just looking at. But we now do that across a spatial region in a raster format, where we can also include things like tree harvest and forest disturbance, fire, urbanization, and those kinds of things. So now we can start to look more realistically about what happens to tree species and forests over time in a spatial way. And so to do that, Wen J. Wang and Jacob and others found a way to incorporate the linkages model or integrate it with the Landis Pro model. And so you can see here how the Landis Pro model incorporates the soil, or the linkages model incorporates the soil data and all the biogeochemical processes into this Landis model that then models tree growth and survival and competition over time in these cells across the landscape. But now they include things like harvest, insect mortality, wind, dispersal, and so on. And we've incorporated these soils data into linkages, and ultimately what we're getting at here is that these outputs are telling Landis what the maximum growing space is and what the species establishment is. What's the likely that a species can establish in these areas of these landscapes now based on the soils and the climate. And you can see that we've taken this at a regional level now. We've started producing multiple papers that really model these changes in tree species in forests across pretty large regions. And so I'll show you a couple examples. Here's one of the examples of the outputs here, where they modeled different climate scenarios on harvest on tree species distribution. And what they've seen is that tree species both contracted and expanded in their ranges, but that in general, these distributional changes in these different species that they looked at were slow, and they lag behind the potential distributions. And that's because forests are relatively resilient. These trees are resilient, and if they're there, they're going to survive until there's a source of mortality that's going to remove them. Then after that point, maybe the tree species would shift over to something else. So in that case, harvest and disturbance would accelerate that process. And that's what we see here. For example, in sugar maple, if we look at just the current climate, we see that there in general is some colonization and some persistence if we just continue a current climate. However, under that access model, that severe climate change model, you can see that the distribution of sugar maple, we see a lot of local extinction through much of the Ozarks, and really only some persistence along the northern portion of this region. The same thing is there with or without harvest. Shortleaf pine, as we look at through the Gulf, the Missouri to Gulf region, you see that we see a lot of colonization. In fact, the climate becomes suitable with the soils to support shortleaf pine. However, if climate change does carry on and we have harvest, we see that source of transition then. Without harvest, we see a general persistence. The same thing holds true with white oak. And so you can start to see how these effects play out then spatially over time. In a different analysis, Jacob examined how interactions between climate change and adaptive management strategies affected the distribution of species. And so this graph that I'm showing here are these ellipses that really kind of reflect the important or the most concentrated areas or ranges of these tree species. And what we're seeing is that during the first 100 years of simulation, again, management had the strongest influence. Climate took a while. But following that first 100 years, the transition, there's different strategies that Jacob tested, a transition management strategy, as well as a system migration strategy, and so on. What he found were some of these strategies were very effective at preserving the dominance of some of these species. And the way we would look at that is between the dotted ellipses versus the solid, and you can see that in some of these species here, the dotted ellipses really show a contraction in the shift up from the range based on the current climate under these different climate models. So for some of these strategies, for some species, it really benefited to do some transition management and so on. For other species, it maybe didn't affect it as much. And this, again, just comes down to the interaction of the soils, the climate, and the tree species traits. And so finally, just to get to the last example here, this is where we take some of these outputs then, and you can picture taking these maps of these outputs of these landscape factors and species and forest characteristics, and then trying to develop wildlife habitat models that we apply to those to ultimately look at how species might respond to changes in the landscape from the climate and the soil. And so what I'm going to show you here are some of the work that we've done where we've looked at the effect of climate and how it has changed forest habitat and how those ultimately affect a prairie warbler population. And prairie warblers are a species of songbird in the Midwest and elsewhere that is of conservation concern. The species is declining. And its decline is because it's associated with open habitat, so consider like woodlands and savannas, as well as early successional habitat. So it looks for open canopies with some herbaceous layers and understory underneath, and that's really its habitat. And so you can picture how we can take some of those Landis outputs from the different work I've just showed you, and we can derive products such as land covers or forest patch sizes, or in particular canopy cover here. And if we have those kinds of characteristics, we can apply some habitat models that we have for this species, in particular here, large patch sizes being more suitable, and lower canopy cover being more suitable for prairie warbler. And we can input these kinds of spatial maps into the habitat models to ultimately estimate carrying capacities and abundances of the species across the region. Okay, not only can we do that, but then we can incorporate that with other demographic habitat models such as survival and reproduction. So that way we can actually model what the prairie warbler population in this particular region here, the central hardwoods, would do over time under different climate change scenarios. So you see here, this graph here shows the projections for prairie warblers in the central hardwoods under 3 climate scenarios. A scenario that assumes the current climate would continue on, a moderate climate change scenario, and then an extreme climate change scenario. And you can see here, we project, just like we currently observe, a declining prairie warbler population. And under the current climate, it continues to decline. However, you can see here that we start to see under extreme climate change that the population, at least in terms of habitat now, at least the effects of habitat, the population starts to reduce those declines and ultimately rebounds to start growing. And you can see here in this map of where that population growth occurred in our simulations and our analyses. It occurred in that southwest portion of the central hardwoods. Okay, that's where most of the population was growing or at least maintaining itself. So what's going on there then, right? Let's dive in and actually see what's going on. Well, it's really interesting. If we go back to those outputs that look at how the forests grow based on the soils and climate, we can see that based on those simulations, the southwest portion of this region saw a decrease in the productivity, much like Jacob saw in those other independent analyses, where those forests were transitioning to woodlands and more open forests. So in other words, that loss of productivity, we're seeing a decrease in canopy cover and opening of these forests, which ultimately created over time that prairie warbler habitat. So as a result, our population model showed that this became an increasingly important area, or could become an increasingly important area to conserve prairie warblers. So this gives you just a few examples of how the soils are really an important aspect of understanding what's happening in our ecosystem. But to finish up on, one thing I want to look at is I want to highlight the idea that that Sky and others just talked about, is this idea that now as we start to address climate change management and mitigation more directly, as we're really starting to focus in on the ways to address it, carbon management is becoming more and more talked about, right? It's becoming more and more important. And we need to realize, and in the Forest Service, they have realized that forest carbon and soil carbon is a major asset in terms of understanding how we can manage for climate change. And this just kind of illustration here by the Forest Service just kind of shows that idea of the boom and bust cycle of forest carbon. But I want to kind of emphasize the idea that below ground carbon storage is about 50% of the forest carbon. Okay? And in fact, that's a great asset to know that in terms of our management, but it can also be a problem, especially when we start to think about the boreal forest, right? And the fires and the thawing that's going on in the boreal regions. That's a huge source of carbon that's going to be potentially released from the soil, right? So we have a major hurdle to get by here in some of that. And it's not just the boreal region. If you look at some of these recent data from the Forest Service, if you look at across these different regions, and in particular in Alaska and the north, and some of these other northern regions, the amount of soil organic carbon related to the other sources of carbon in these regions is often equal or greater than those other sources. And so the idea of soils being important to carbon management and being an important consideration, I think is just, is ripe for looking into and continuing to work with. So just a couple takeaways from this aspect here from my point of view. As we've been developing these studies and looking at climate impacts, many of the climate change processes affecting forest and wildlife are mediated through soils. Okay? Soils are critical, and that information on soils is critical to better understanding what impacts are likely, but also where they're likely, and so we can do better planning at a landscape and regional level. And because these processes are so complex, that actually might, even though it's difficult to kind of study them, that might be a good thing in the long run, because that complexity gives us the ability to find other ways to address these impacts or mitigate them by looking at other factors. A great example would be if drought and water stress are affecting our stands of trees because of the limited precipitation or the increased temperatures. Well, we know soil properties to some degree are fixed, although they can change over time, but we're still limited with soil properties. But if we know those properties of the soil and we know where the potential threats might be, then we can go in and say, well, let's reduce the competition among trees, for example. Let's thin out a stand so there's not as much competition, and we can create healthier stands then in terms of water availability. So that's where that complexity and knowing that about the soils really starts to play out and pay off. So with that, I'll open this up, taking any questions. I appreciate the chance to talk to you guys.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Do we have any questions?
I do not have any in the MUConf9 email account right now.
Tom, I was curious, your first two examples about the die-off of the different species. Do you see these migrating north, or the whole biomes migrating?
We do. There's certainly, and so some of the other graphs I can show you is what I showed you were some of the simulated plot data that actually showed what would happen. But if you just look at the potential, and so not just growth, but actually where the climate conditions become suitable along with the soil conditions, they do show the potential for range expansion northward. The thing about it is that dispersal process is also a very lengthy drawn out process. And so a lot of our actual modeling in land does not show that large increase on the northern front. And equally, just like I mentioned, without a source of mortality, we also don't show a lot of recession on the southern ranges of these species, just because without any major source of mortality, if we're not accounting for that, those species aren't going to die, and they're not going to transition to a new forest species.
Very good. Very interesting. Thank you. We really appreciate that presentation on the importance of soils and, focusing in on soil moisture. And again, that's another good segue into the next presentation that's co-authored by Dylan Beaudet and Zamir Libahova. And the foundation of a dynamic soil survey is the soil water balance. So Dylan, will you take off with your presentation, please?
Thank you, Curtis. Let's see. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, Dylan, we can hear you.
Okay, and here we go. Let's see. Zamir and I decided to roll the dice and put some animations in our presentation, and I think we've all seen how that can go terribly wrong at conferences. So I'm going to hope for the best here. If it doesn't work, I'll just improvise. So hi everyone, thanks for joining us. I know this is a difficult form to try and present exciting scientific investigations and findings, but we're going to make the case in the next half hour. Some might even call it obvious, but we're still going to make the case that a dynamic soil survey, or squeezing temporal data and maybe even more spatially explicit data out of our soil survey, is complicated. It's something that we're calling dynamic soil survey, and the effectiveness, the success of dynamic soil survey is really going to build on getting the water balance correct. And when I say correct, I mean spatially, temporally correct, in a sense that the scale at which we estimate the water balance and then upscale those values and estimates, making sure that the scale at which we do the work matches the scale of the questions that people are asking of soil survey. Are we talking about a soil series over the course of 30 years? Are we talking about a 30-meter patch on the ground tomorrow? Both of those are what I'm calling dynamic soil survey questions. They require drastically different data inputs, different mechanisms to do the work, and ultimately a different delivery system for those data. And what's playing in the background here are some simulations of volumetric water content at two different depth intervals in the, this is in Indiana, part of the Shawnee Hills project. And this is something we're going to talk a little bit more about, but I thought it made for a nice flashy slide. I do want to emphasize that before we start pitching some new product or some new idea, we should probably circle back and say why we're doing it, maybe provide a little bit of justification. I think everyone on this, at the National Cooperative Soil Survey, understands why spatially and temporally explicit estimates are important, but clearly dynamic soil survey represents kind of the next dimension into which we want to extend our soil survey information, and the degree to which we can provide conservation practice recommendations. Because at the end of the day, that's kind of what soil survey is supposed to support. Good decisions made with the best available data. And I'd like to thank Zamir Libahova, my co-author here. He did a lot of work years ago to put these data together, and so we're going to build on that work today. Okay. And Zamir, if you don't know him, he has an excellent sense of humor, and the alternative title for this talk really is turning Surgo into a movie. That's what we're talking about. Taking 3 dimensions and pushing it into 4. And I think the analogy here is useful. We paint our pictures using the soil series, the component concept. Each one of these things have unique characteristics, functions, roles in an ecosystem, certain constraints within a managed ecosystem. And it's important to understand how these entities, components, series, maybe even point data sitting below those, at a finer scale, how do these things react and how do they change through time? So that's really what dynamic soil survey is all about. Quick acknowledgements. We are standing on the shoulders of giants here. This is work and these are concepts that have been talked about for a very long time. We have the privilege of presenting some pretty pictures and movies and things like that. So I just want to acknowledge all of these folks who worked on the Shawnee Hills Las Catina project. And then also a special thanks to the Pacific Northwest National Lab. They put together this distributed hydrology soil vegetation model, or I'm going to try and say DHSVM about 20 times in this talk. Without their work and making it an open source project, well, we wouldn't have had some of these great videos. So I want to say thanks. I think the big question, at least in my mind, when somebody, or when the term dynamic soil survey was first presented was, well, how do we go from a static product to a dynamic product? And the wheels start spinning. I start scribbling on papers. Zamir sends me some excellent figures, brings up a decade's worth of work. And at the end of the day, the only way to go from a static to a dynamic product is to instrument, measure, characterize, essentially work in great detail within benchmark landscapes and within specific catinas that can then be upscaled using SURGO and the soil landscape model and concepts like the MLRA and LRU. SURGO and soil survey is an evolving product. It's not perfect, but it represents an excellent scaling mechanism for those studies and those investigations which are conducted in great detail that require a lot of money and effort and full-time employees. So the degree to which a detailed investigation versus just a synthesis of existing data, that will ultimately depend on the dynamic soil survey question. So I think it's helpful to think about how we balance complexity here. Dynamic soil survey can be a lot of different things to a lot of different people, lots of different questions, and each one of those questions is going to have a target scale, it's going to have a modeling domain, and it's going to have data requirements. So as the caretakers, the future caretakers of the dynamic soil survey, we need to strike a balance here between scale and data requirements. Are we working at the PEDON component or series scale of data space? Are we talking about highly specific or more, I don't want to say nebulous, but more abstract concepts? Or are we working at spatially and temporally explicit entities, the pixel or the voxel at an hour or daily time step? Right, so there's a huge spectrum of different models that we use to convert the static into the dynamic. If I left your model out of this slide, I'm sorry, because there are a whole bunch of really great ones. But I'm going to talk about 3 different approaches here, and mostly just 2. The so-called backup plan, that is the leaky bucket, which conceptually is just treating soil as a bucket with a hole in it. The size of the bucket is related to the available water holding capacity. Inputs and outputs are dictated by a couple climatic parameters and maybe a coefficient to account for deep percolation. Incredibly simplistic, usually describing the soil in bulk. Soil morphology doesn't really fit into this type of model because we treat the soil as a single homogeneous chunk of bucket. The Newhall model is, I think, a pretty decent upgrade to that approach. If you're not familiar with it, I'd be happy to talk about it later. It has fallen by the wayside in recent years just because of evolving changes in the operating systems and programming languages, but I'll mention in just a second, there's a new effort by University of Georgia faculty and postdocs to reimagine Newhall in a much more efficient context. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so we got the leaky bucket, we got Newhall. Newhall really is, I think, where dynamic soil survey is going to focus for the relatively simple questions that span, say, weeks to months to 30-year normals, and for concepts that are a little bit less specific, such as the component or the series. So that's the mechanism we use for essentially temporal upscaling. Okay, the DHSVM model is the Cadillac of soil water balance models. And this thing has some huge data requirements, but it can generate incredibly detailed realizations of entire watersheds. So that then would represent the other end of the spectrum. So this balance is something that we have to keep in mind, and maybe this sort of sets the subtext for the rest of what we talk about. This is from a presentation we gave to the chief of the NRCS. We were pitching the idea of dynamic soil survey, and we wanted to talk about what we could do now and maybe what we could do on into the future. And well, kind of like the title of this talk, the thing that kept spinning around in my head was the fact that really the water balance is sort of the master variable here. Like I said, dynamic soil survey is kind of the mixture of static and dynamic. And that mixture is, the ingredients are put together and baked to perfection in some sort of model. I've highlighted the word model in this slide a bunch of different times to remind myself that really that's where this magic is happening, but that's also where the responsibility comes in, choosing the appropriate model and interpreting it through the lens of, say, a soil scientist, an ecologist, pedologist, bringing all these disciplines together to treat these models as physical approximations of reality and not as black box, I throw my data in and I hope for the best. That's what we're presenting here, is almost the polar opposite of that approach. Getting back to the whole water balance, why that's important. Well, many of the other parameters that we want to deliver within the dynamic soil survey involve dynamic soil properties, organic matter turnover, micronutrient availability, how these things change through time, heavy metal fate and transport, trafficability. Fortunately, if we get the water balance right, I think we're going to be well on the way to getting these other dynamic soil properties, getting those estimates hammered out. Okay, so really I'm restating the same idea. Static, model, dynamic. Quick sidetrack, like I said, the Newhall model is being completely rewritten, a brand new interface in the R language. There should be some web service interfaces to it as well if you don't feel like getting your hands dirty with R. There should be a whole new set of CONUS scale products. Really interesting stuff. This is Grant Snitker, Rajendra Pandra, and Matt Levi at University of Georgia. They're doing extensive testing right here in Oklahoma with the Mesonet sites, and for a model as simplistic as the Newhall model, it's doing surprisingly well. And this will all be open source software available in an R package, hopefully soon. All right, so I'm going to talk first about this kind of the simple end of the spectrum. The R Newhall model isn't quite ready yet, so we're going to go to our backup plan, which is the leaky bucket. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this Centralia ARS research farm in Missouri, which I'm sad that we don't get to visit, or I don't get to visit with you all and talk about, how many horizons there might be. Some of the representative soils, this was more of a crutch for me because I've never been to Missouri, and I've certainly never been to this research farm. And I'm kind of a fan of these type of figures, but clearly these are pretty wet soils, probably experiencing flooding. We've got some endoaqueps and things like that. So clearly these are complicated systems where the soil water balance is controlled by more than just the monthly climate or the daily climate. So we're approximating the water balance over a 30-year period, or monthly over a 30-year period in some of these next examples. So that's my caveat right there. Thankfully, with a simple model for a simple water balance expressed over months or weeks or years, we can relax some of the data requirements. We can use Surgo data for some of the hydraulic properties to develop a theoretical water retention curve. We can use hill slope position proportions from Surgo to try and at least sort these different components or series according to where they sit within the soil landscape continuum. And we can use PRISM data or DAMET data as a rough approximation of the local climate. So what does that look like? A water balance for the ADCO component right in the middle of the Centralia ARS research farm might look something like this. You see these kind of figures in textbooks. A lot of them are handmade. This one was not handmade. This one was generated using a Surgo component, the available water retention data from that component, and then the PRISM data for, within an 800-meter grid cell that overlaps with this specific delineations. That's a reasonable first cut, and that's a pretty nice way to demonstrate to people what a water balance looks like at a very, from 30,000 feet for a specific component. We should have these kind of figures available for every soil series generated from series level summaries, I'd say probably within a month or so. And you'll probably see them up on SoilWeb. So we can refine this in time just a little bit more by switching from PRISM data, which is at a monthly time step, to DayMet data at a daily time step. And we're looking at the interval from 1988 to 2018. Now this type of water balance, this representation of a water balance is quite a bit different than the monthly water balance. And it's quite a bit different from the type of output you would get from a distributed hydrologic model. This is more of a theoretical description of a probabilistic representation of moisture states. So what are moisture states? Well, this is just a classification of the theoretical water retention curve developed from the hydrologic properties, or excuse me, the hydraulic property estimates from Surgo component data. Clearly, this is a rough approximation of what you might expect, but the data that sit behind this probabilistic representation can be used, they can be restated in all kinds of different ways. So for example, what might I expect if my cumulative precipitation is in the 5th percentile over this 30-year period, what might I expect for the rest of, say, the growing season in terms of soil moisture? So there's a lot hidden behind this figure and the data used to generate this figure, but this was the best that I could do to fit into a slide. A lot going on here. We could do this for every component or every soil series, depending on the level of specificity that we're after, both in terms of the hydraulic parameters used to develop the water retention curve. They could be specific to a single point on the ground, say a scan station. They could represent a single component, or they could represent all instances of a component correlated to, say, the ADCO or Putnam, any of these soil series. These are all from the Centralia research farm. And they're kind of fun to look at. I would expect to have these developed and up on SoilWeb within the next month or so as well. And just a concrete example, so those are more theoretical, kind of a dog and pony show. This right here is an actual example of putting the leaky bucket to work. California land capability class, rather than non-irrigated land capability class, is tied very specifically to a 1962 paper by Arkley and Ulrich, where they laid out the concept of the 4 ETA zonation within California. And this is the theoretical actual evapotranspiration given 4 inches or 10 centimeters of water holding capacity. And on the left is the original publication, which has been part of the California NRCS guidance for 30, 40 years now, actually 50 years, used to actually populate the land capability class in our components. And recently, with the help of Andrew Brown and Steve Campbell and some other folks out in California and Oregon, we've come up with a new gridded representation, a more spatially explicit representation of this concept by using the leaky bucket at each one of these grid cells from the PRISM stack. So even though it's a simplistic approach that is a little bit disappointing when we know all of these other different things about how the soil functions, at certain scales, it's incredibly effective. Okay, I'm going to switch gears here and going to use a bunch of slides that Zamir had put together. So thank you, Zamir. And these have to do with really like the Cadillac version of hydrologic modeling at the Katina to catchment to on up given computational constraints and our ability to satisfy those really arbitrary watersheds really a simulation-based approach to moving water around in the landscape. And this thing builds heavily on soil information, hydraulic conductivity, porosity, all of those very difficult to measure soil properties that we know are oh so important, but typically approximated from other soil properties in lieu of actual measurements. So DHSVM, that's what I'm going to be talking about here. This distributed hydrologic or hydrology soil vegetation model does what we do in our minds, and hopefully what is a reasonable representation of reality as water moves through the landscape and interacts with the soil material. It's an approximation, and it gets us a little bit farther than the leaky bucket. Just to emphasize, this is an incredibly complex model, which means it has very, I'm going to say it has strict, it's data hungry. This model requires a lot of information to run. And that's okay because we have a lot of information. A lot of it can come from our existing soil survey, but some of it's going to need to be buttressed by newly collected soil property and hydraulic measurements. We're going to talk, give a couple examples here from this Shawnee Hills project in Indiana, sorry. Clearly, I haven't been there. So anyways, these represent small catchments, you know, anywhere between 15 to 20 acres. We're going to be looking at this pasture catchment here. Just kind of an overview of the soils that you might expect to find out there. This gillpin is one of the more common soil series that we find here, but it's an incredibly complex part of the world. A little bit of background. I mean, there's a lot going on here, but really, to answer the question, how do we go from catchment to HUC 12 to MLRA? Because the catchment scale is where we can actually instrument these things. We can't dig up and instrument every square mile of the United States, but we can do that within, say, target or catchments that are representative. Soil landscape models then are the key by which we upscale these things. This is what it looks like on the ground. I want to get to the good stuff here so we don't lose any time for questions. It's an outline of the watershed. You can see there was a lot of instrumentation, a lot of measurements. You might recognize some of these folks. These slides are really to emphasize that if you want to model a four-dimensional, so X, Y, Z, and time, if you want a four-dimensional representation of the soil-water balance, you're going to have to do your homework and you're going to have to do your field work. So thank you, Zamir, and everyone else who worked on the Shawnee's Hill project so that we could make a pretty animation, in this case, of the depth to water table for 6 different head-ons that were sampled within this small catchment, 15 to 20 acres. And while it's fun to watch this thing here, so these are depths to water table on this side and then sort of annotated on the right with little sketches. The little blue bars represent that depth to water table. The key point here is, besides being fun to look at, is that it allows us to see and really test our hypothesis that soil depth, the effective soil depth for this area is really mitigated by abrupt textural changes, fragipans, you know, those type of parameters. We can intuit that most of the time, but it's nice to test that with a physically based model. And then Zamir added this figure here to remind me that really we're looking at KSAT limited water movement by abrupt textural changes and fragipans and things like that, and not necessarily a depth to contact. That's really important because in some cases we use maps of depth to contact or depth to first restrictive feature as an input to some type of water balance, and that may not always be the most appropriate. In this case, these are very wet soils, and it's all about perched water tables. You see the exact same thing happen out west in the Sierra Nevada foothills. They're just not quite as soggy and for not quite as long. So this DHSVM model can also generate estimates for volumetric water content. And if you have time and the available hydraulic data, you can convert those back to water potential, which is really what plants and animals respond to, and really the target variable that we try to manage for, or categories, classes, representations of that water retention curve. How many days are we below the permanent wilting point? How many days are we above field capacity? That kind of information is really important for land managers, conservation practices, and unfortunately isn't well represented in this pretty movie here, but I think we can all extrapolate what we're seeing here. There are periods of time where different depths are completely saturated, and other depths, closer to the surface, really, that are far more dynamic. If you're managing the top 15 centimeters, well, that's a completely different picture than attempting to manage the top, say, 45 or 50 centimeters. So, in conclusion, doing this kind of work requires a lot of field and lab measurements of soil hydraulic properties. That is a time-consuming process, and it takes a lot of existing or new full-time employees with strong backgrounds in soil science, field methods, numerical methods, and really communicating and visualizing this information. We're really good at collecting data, archiving it, and cooking it down into the Sergo product. And I do think that there's a lot of room for NRCS, Soil Plant Science Division, to work with our cooperators to communicate the value of these data in the context of a dynamic soil survey. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take them right now.
Thank you, Dylan. Any questions?
I do have a question. Just need to read it to make sure. Have you corroborated the runoff probability after saturation with field data, H flumes, or another edge of field method? What does that process look like?
That's a great question, and might take an entirely new presentation to answer. Zamir, do you want to add anything from the Shawnee Hills project?
Yes, that's a good question, actually, but like Dylan said, it's a bit more involved and complicated. We do have, however, if you notice in that one of the slides, install the flume to capture the runoff. And that's for a good reason, because you want to make sure that you tie the whole water balance at the end of that outlet. And so that is our way to go back and double check that the runoffs, yeah, correct. That is our way to go and double check and make sure that the runoff we're experiencing in the soil moisture movement and water table depth are really responding in the same way that the flume is showing the stream flow and the discharge.
Okay. Okay. All right. So did that answer the question?
I mean, I could go on and on, but we don't have time, so I was just trying to do my best.
John replied in the chat. Yes, thank you.
Any others?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you again, Dylan and Zamir. Really appreciate it. And so now we're coming up on a 15-minute break. So we'll be on break from 2 o'clock until 2:15. And at 2:15, we'll get back going with our next speaker, David Limbo. So see you at 2:15.